is doing and is not telling people what is and is not. With us now from New York, Senior Fellow for the Atlantic Council, Jamie Metzl. He's also the author of Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. Jamie, fascinating. Great to have you here. Really thrilled to have this discussion. Let me start off with this, something that I remember our correspondent telling me, Stephen Jiang in Beijing. He told me about a week ago or so that this was Xi Jinping's Katrina moment. How is he faring?
It's too early to tell. Xi Jinping was in the picture, then he was out of the scene for a while, and we weren't hearing much from him. Now he's stepping forward, and it's a big, big risk. But this is a moment for leadership. China was relatively slow in the beginning, but now it's gearing up. Major efforts happening in China. And if it can be contained, then Xi Jinping could emerge from this much stronger. If it's not contained, there'll be a lot of criticism because really the whole system inside of China is responsible both for the weaknesses of the response and for the strengths. For the weaknesses, the early voices were suppressed. I mean, there were doctors in Wuhan who were saying, hey, this is really serious, and they were forced to recant, to sign confessions, and that was a big problem. But now when you have an authoritarian regime like China, you're able to garner resources to have a massive response, and that's what's happening.
Right at the beginning, we heard from the WHO basically applauding Beijing for the way how quickly they got a handle on the situation to try and contain it. But what we've seen in the last 24, 48 hours are very rare public calls for transparency as well as accountability. We've seen multiple open letters, in fact, circulated online, signed, I believe, by prominent Chinese academics and intellectuals. How unprecedented is this, Jamie?
This is a big deal. First, for the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, who's an amazing leader, he was criticized for being too strong in his praise of China early on. And what we've seen is the WHO has backtracked a little bit because there are conflicting signs out of China. There was the initial suppression, then there was a bit more openness, and now there are reports of some reporters and bloggers who are being detained for trying to spread openness and transparency. And then inside of China, there have been some very prominent voices who are saying, hey, part of the problem is that when you don't have the open lanes for communication, the people whose voices need to be heard aren't being heard. So as you mentioned, there have been prominent petitions passed around. This is a really big deal. Could this be a watershed moment for speech in China? If Xi Jinping is able to contain things quickly, I think we'll see those voices for greater speech rights suppressed. But if this problem grows, I think then that we could see otherwise.
That is fascinating because our correspondents right around the region, they've been telling us how they've seen a rise really in anger, mostly online, being felt in China towards the government of Xi Jinping, especially, as you pointed out, after the death of Li Wenliang.
Correct. Yes, and this is a really big, Li Wenliang has become a symbol for someone who's really risked everything. And given that the entire mythology of the Communist Party is about the risk, that's what the Long March is, people putting their lives on the line for their beliefs and for their country, and that's what he did. And so this is really an important issue for China, for the Chinese Communist Party, and ultimately for the world.
Let me ask you this briefly, Jamie. Do you trust the numbers that we're getting out of China, or do you think they're underestimated?
No. I mean, we all know that all of the numbers coming out of China are suspect. And part of that, across the board, whether it's economics or public health, is manipulation. But part of that is that the whole infrastructure isn't in place to even figure out who has COVID-19 or Wuhan coronavirus, whatever you want to call it, who has pneumonia. They're using some relatively primitive screening methods like CAT scan. There is a capacity. Now there's a mouth swab test that can be used, but it's very difficult to deploy that at scale. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that China is doing something slippery. It's just the infrastructure is not yet in place to figure out who has been infected and who hasn't. And because there's such a long incubation period, these numbers could be expanding exponentially, and we wouldn't even know it for a little while.
Very important context there. Jamie Metzl, thank you very much. Great to have you on the show.
My pleasure.
After months of devastating fires in Australia, finally some relief. But we'll tell you about a new challenge that some are fighting now when we come back.